very lovely to be. It would be very lovely to be in Oslo with all of you and chatting, but Zoom is wonderful as well. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you to the panelists for agreeing to discuss this very, I would say, preliminary article. These are sort of my preliminary thoughts on thinking about decolonization in the university ahead of doing something more substantial. So this is all very much up in the air in terms of ideas, and very much up for precisely for discussion and reworking. Sindre, I think you told me to talk for about 20 minutes at the beginning. So that's what I will do. I'm not going to presume everybody has read the piece, but I'm also not going to go through it line by line. I'll just draw out what I think would be particularly useful for discussion, and leave you to read it in your own time. I'll sort of begin really by talking about how decolonization has become this kind of salient, let us say, trendy term, and how it appears to have caught the imagination, the intellectual imagination in Britain, in North America, and other places once again now in the present moment. I do note that in its 21st century iteration, particularly in the global North, decolonization is really something that is coming from the global South. The line of influence is running from the South northwards. And that is a line of influence that I think is not only often overlooked, but is very central to thinking about decolonization itself. The other question that the essay begins by posing is asking whether there's any relevance really for sort of decolonization in Western Europe, in the former metropole. And it asks whether it really makes sense for universities in London and Paris, Rome, Lisbon to engage with the project of decolonizing. Now, my answer is broadly yes, and I give a couple of reasons for that. One is that we do have a diversifying, very slowly diversifying, but nonetheless diversifying student body, who are themselves posing quite trenchant questions. Why is my curriculum white, for instance, as the NUS in the National Union of Students puts it in Britain? Of course, the danger there is that diversity itself is conflated with decolonization, and that is certainly how it seems to be used by the manageriate in my own university. At the same time, I think diversity is incredibly important in its own right, and it's also important in a pedagogical and intellectual sense, because what we do not want is monocultures. And the opposite of monoculture is not necessarily multiculture, but I will set that aside for now. That said, decolonization isn't quite diversity, so we have to ask ourselves what that means, and what that means particularly in the global North. And the essay really sort of starts to think about what the valences and resonances of decolonization might be specifically in the global North. But obviously, this is a conversation that has to be had with the global South. And I'm using these very broad categories just for ease of reference right now. But really, decolonization has to be a conversation. It has to be dialogical. Now, the other obvious reason, I suppose, to say decolonization is something relevant to the Western university is that any university, any institution that produces knowledge has to think about how it has constituted itself and what materials and methodologies it works with. When I say Western, I have italicized that in my head, because what is at stake in some ways is the very creation of the West itself. And Michel Roth-Trouillot has put this very beautifully. He says, if the West was created somewhere at the beginning of the 16th century, then actually the category of the Western is unthinkable. Unthinkable is, of course, Trujillo's term, without imperialist power, plunder, and expansion. So the very idea of the West, any act of self-reflection in the West, has to also involve thinking about the constitution of the West, right? So very often we have establishment voices talk about recuperating or protecting Western values or Western civilization or Western literature, as if the Western could be constituted without the non-West. So, you know, these claims are not just, you know, kind of xenophobic and narrow, but they are also opaque to themselves. There is no understanding of the use of the Western or the constitution of the Western when the term Western is bandied about. Fanon, of course, very useful here, reminding us that Europe is literally the creation of the third world. And he's, of course, referring largely to material terms, the ways in which Europe as an entity was made from the labor, resources, and profits of the third world, the colonized world. But we can extend that to say that Europe's understanding of itself is inseparable from its material world making, or how it interpreted and impacted the globe. And one question I pose in the course of the essay is to ask about intellectual and cultural debts, alongside, obviously, other kinds of debts and reparations. So we talk about third world debt, we don't talk about first world debt. And it seems to me that that question, both in a material and cultural sense, is tied up with the question of decolonizing. So one fundamental task of decolonization, I argue, is reparative of the European itself, seeking to understand and to extend knowledge about how cultures and communities outside those which are racialized as white and European have also given and shaped Europe. So this is something that I keep coming back to: reverse influence, reverse tutelage. Alongside this, and this is something you will be familiar with, intellectual decolonization has to take cognizance of the damage done to the cultural and epistemological resources of colonized regions through the imperial enterprise. We know that the imperial enterprise resulted in huge amounts of violence done to resources, cultural and epistemological. So what do we do in relation to that damage? How do we repair that damage? How do we bring back to mind knowledge and methodologies and ideas which have been lost through the imperial endeavor? I'm quite keen at this point not to be seen to be advocating knowledges in the plural. Quite often, in a sense, the answer to Eurocentrism or to the authority of Europe is seen to be a multiplication of different knowledges. And I actually think that pluralization is the easy answer. In fact, it is a rare culture, whether it's European or non-European, that develops knowledge in a vacuum. So we actually need to be asking whether that which is presented to us as European is in fact European in some absolute sense. So moving on, there is a section of the essay which raises these preliminary questions, and then there is a section in the next bit, which I won't discuss in great detail, which just talks about the origin of the term decolonization and the ways in which it moves from being a term that really it comes out of the French military presence in Algeria, and it refers to the military withdrawal, the French military retreat from Algeria in the 1830s. But like other concepts, it has traveled. It traveled eventually to meaning transfer of power, nation building, etc. But it really becomes what it is today in our discussions. It becomes that through the literature of anti-colonialism. And it comes to us through people like Fanon and Césaire, but many others also thinking in the middle of the 20th century, who take the term decolonization and give it a certain heft, and give it a certain radical reordering. And Stuart Ward has written about this very nicely. He talks about the ways in which, Fanon, for instance, takes decolonization and absolutely turns it upside down and gives it a completely new ideological content. And the important thing to realize here, I think, is that this isn't just about Caliban taking the master's language, but it's actually Fanon, Césaire, Senghor, and others picking up the term decolonization and investing on it the experience and understanding of actual anti-colonial struggles. That is, struggles against the combine of colonialism, capitalism, and racism. I have a section of the essay, which I'm not going to go into in great detail, but it will become eventually clear, I hope, why I do discuss it. There is a section where I engage, I hope sympathetically, but also critically, with Eve Tuck and Kay Yang's very influential and important piece, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. I am very much in sympathy with the argument that decolonization can't just come to stand in for whatever you want it to stand in for. It's a fundamentally material project that you have to think about the material underpinnings of colonialism in order to think about decolonizing. They also point out rightly that decolonization is something of a meaningless piety if you don't enact material reparations, whether of land or of other elements of colonialism. Where I do pull away from them, and I would say disagree quite sharply with their analysis, is in the advocacy of incommensurability. I can see why they use it. I mean, I think one of the reasons that, one of the things that they're very keen to point out is that you can't do 100 other things and not talk about land and say we are decolonizing, that the question of land in North America, or indeed in many other places, is utterly central. So don't think that you can just carry on and do your cultural decolonizing without thinking about land. I don't, however, think that that translates into incommensurability. I do think that struggles for human rights, social justice, civil rights should not be conflated with decolonization, but I do not think that they are incommensurable with decolonization. In general, I am, I would say, critical of the valorization of radical alterity and incommensurability. In part, that is because my understanding of anti-colonialism and decolonization, as it's been theorized in multiple contexts, quite often as much invokes commonality of human endeavor as it does difference. So I don't think that we have this rather sharp divide between commensurability and absolute difference. I think, again, this is a dialogical and also dialectical process, and I find it more helpful to think in those terms. The center of this essay is really me thinking out aloud about decolonization and thinking that decolonization cannot really be discussed without discussing anti-colonialism. That anti-colonialism has to be, in some perhaps obvious sense, it has to be the principle that underlies decolonization, right? Because in a sense, academically, we seem to have jumped from talking about colonialism and colonization and colonial discourse to now talking about decolonization. And we might have left out that very significant body of practice, of historical unfolding, of thinking that really comes under the rubric of anti-colonialism. I also raise it in relation to the issues that Tuck and Yang raise, which is to say anti-colonialism wasn't always only about land or only about sovereignty, that actually anti-colonial movements, which were fairly messy and which themselves were often at loggerheads within the same broad movements, they actually give us a range of issues that are relevant to decolonization, right? So yes, land claims and land use, but also working conditions, labor rights, trading practices, market regulation, agricultural policies, anti-racism, education, disarmament, very central aspect of some anti-colonial movements, women's rights, inevitably inflected anti-colonial and national movements, and of course, ecology, environment, and resource and land protection, management and protection. So to me, it seems to me that anti-colonialism is a helpful term to bring back to academic discussions of decolonization today. And I think that anti-colonialism really doesn't allow us to retreat into the incommensurable. It enables a discussion of decolonization, which is necessarily dialogical, but it also, I think, does something which we should do, and I think would find helpful to do. It doesn't see decolonization as this state of affairs to be arrived at. It really is a process with a horizon of aspiration. So for me, at this point in history, at this point of intellectual history, it's as important to pose relevant questions as it is to finding answers. Okay, so just skipping on. Yes, I just want to come back to the whole question of decolonization as not being a metaphor for social justice. But I want to point out that social justice is integral to decolonization. There is no anti-colonial movement or no movement for decolonization that doesn't pose the question of social justice. And the question of social justice is not just posed between colonizer and colonized, but it is posed in relation to the context that is seeking to decolonize itself. So, in short, decolonization is meaningless without a set of principles, anti-colonialism, that enables it to emerge as a practice that is sensitive to the present and to context, while yet steeped in historical awareness. And here it's important to say that where land might be central, let us say in Palestine, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, in other parts of the world, it might not be land. It might be the question of sweated labor. It might be the question of resource extraction and environmental depredation. These are all material questions, but they're not necessarily the same thing. But the fact that they're not necessarily the same thing does not make them incommensurable. The next section of the essay talks about whether universities can be decolonized. And the answer, in as much as I provide one, is that yes, in a modest and provisional way, as long as it bears in mind that it cannot be the sole site of decolonization. It certainly would mean that we have to be deeply attentive to questions of privatization, corporatization, all of which are, of course, fundamental to colonialism. But I agree with Chandra Mohanty that universities are places where knowledges are colonized, are given authority, are often even privatized, but they are still, at this point in time, I don't know for how much longer, but at this point in time and in many places, they're also contested spaces. And I want to hang on to that sense of contestation. And I suggest along the way that instead of talking about decolonizing the university, maybe we should be talking about anti-colonial universities, anti-colonialism being part of the work of a university, by which I mean that anti-colonialism can harness oppositional energies, enabling contestations and challenges, but also enabling the imagining and elaboration of alternatives. I think I'm running out of time, maybe another 5 minutes. The essay then goes on to discuss Césaire, who I find actually very, very generative and useful. I keep going back to discourse on colonialism, and I keep finding new things in there. And one thing I find very important about Césaire's work is that he is very, very clear that decolonizing is not a return to some prior state before colonialism. What his focus is on really is on what are the possibilities, on the one hand, that were wiped out by colonialism or pushed to the margins, and on the other hand, what are the possibilities that now we can derive from the experience of history? What might the future look like? And in doing so, how can we think about this cultural and social potential that might have come to fruition if Europe had not so decisively and brutally changed the shape of the world? What other futures might have emerged? And it is really important to stress that he's not saying, what can we recover? He's saying, what are the possibilities that didn't get worked out that we might be able to think about in thinking about the future? Now, in making this point, Césaire says something that I think we must pause on, and I hope we will pause on it today. When he addresses the question, the accusation that he wants to go back to some kind of mythical, romanticized pre-colonial past, he says, no, it is not me who wants to go back to the past. It is the colonizer who has entrenched the past in its worst possible ways. He says, colonialist Europe has grafted modern abuse onto ancient injustice, hateful racism onto old inequality. And he also says very clearly, the old tyrants got on very well with the new ones, by which he's really pointing to the absolute centrality of collaboration in the process of colonialism entrenching itself, a circuit of mutual services and complicity. That's the phrase he uses. So this has then certain important consequences for us today, because it means that decolonization in the global South, as much as anywhere else, necessarily involves identifying these complicities and putting pressure on old tyrannies, now covering themselves up in the garb of not just nationalism, but also indigeneity and decolonization. The example that is closest to my own work and my own biography, and has one which has resurfaced very violently in academic contexts in the last couple of weeks, is that of Hindu ethno-nationalism, or Hindutva, which routinely presents itself as a decolonial force, returning India to an idyllic Hindu state before colonial disruption. I mean, we must assume that. And we do know that the term decolonial, as well as the term decolonize, has been explicitly picked up by ideologues of Hindutva, and it has been presented as a form of decolonization. And I think the thing that I would most want to stress from this piece in that context is this sentence: decolonizing requires that we remain vigilant about its misuse as an alibi for renewed subjugation. And that would apply in the Indian context to Hindu nationalism, and indeed the Indian state acting as a colonial force upon racialized others, whether those are Muslims and Dalits and Adivasis or Kashmiris. We really do have to be deeply attentive to the abuses and hijacking of the ideas of the idea of decolonization or the decolonial. Okay, so I think I have covered a significant bit of what I've wanted to say. I'm going to leave you now with 4 points, what I call 4 preliminary undertakings, which are starting points for our discussions. So the first thing we would need to do in engaging with decolonization is acknowledging that much of what we take for granted, methodologies, practices, disciplines, in university contexts in the West and beyond, are still structured by the imperatives of the European imperial enterprise. For me, the European imperial enterprises can be translated to racial capitalism. We know, and I'm not saying anything that is especially new here, the university was not and is not separable from endeavors of discovery and control, both in the past and in the present. We do know, and this is of course much more visible in the sciences, that capitalism and corporations and privatization shape research agendas and are pushing to shape them even more. And that's something we need to be vigilant about. The second point is, of course, acknowledging that the loss, mutilation, and marginalization of bodies of knowledge and ideas when Europe became the primary authority or arbiter of what was worth knowing and how it is known. Having acknowledged that loss, we need to excavate and recognize lines of influence that run from global south to north or non-Europe to Europe. This includes undoing what Trujillo calls bundles of silences in such a way that the history of the West has to be retold in ways that bring forward the perspective of the world. And the fourth point, which I call relinking, is opening pathways to dialogue and mutually transformative engagement between different cultures, traditions, and approaches to knowledges. And this, I'm stressing this because I think this is different from pluralizing, or indeed from the pluriversity as it has been theorized, because I don't think that pluralization is the answer where dialogue and engagement, mutually critical and transformative engagement might really be the answer, and takes us to something that is much more like relinking. And finally, just to say that I think whatever we end up saying about decolonization, it is a difficult practice, but it is also a practice. And what we need to do is to think about the ways in which we can recover and repair knowledge without retreating into segregated epistemological resources or bodies of knowledge, and without retreating into, I guess, radical othering. And in the course of this discussion, I use the work of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who really talks about ideas as rivers which transform each other when they meet, but that's a long and slightly separate discussion. So I guess I will just stop here and say more in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gopal. That was fantastic. I would now invite our panelists to ask their questions, and we will use up about 15 to 20 minutes to do that. And after that, the panel is open for questions from all our attendees. But if you think of anything while you're attending the webinar, please type your question and we will take them as and when we get to that. So let me invite Bhakti, if I may, to ask your question, please.
Okay. Thank you, Priya. That was absolutely fantastic and good to hear it, then just to always read, that changes the shape of things a bit. So I'm going to see it as a kind of extended conversation that we had already started having for the Los Angeles Review of Books piece, where you so generously answered so many of my questions. And here I want to kind of bring in some of my own concerns and some of the work I've been doing and the challenges I see before me. So for the past few years, I've sort of conspired to take decolonization discourses out of the university or the academic space and see if it can become a useful term and action outside of those spaces. And so at that time, I had conceived of a short book series written for a general audience in an accessible style, not theoretical, And at that time, which was about 4 or so years ago, decolonization was not much of a buzzword. It was more of an inchoate concept that would show up in protests and was getting popularized after the Fees Must Fall in South Africa. But universities in the US and the UK, more, I think the UK have really jumped on this term, and it's had some interesting effects. At my own university, we've had white academics with no expertise on the subject amassing all kinds of funding for ill-formed projects, claiming it's anti-racist, claiming it's decolonial, and so on. But at the same time, we have pushed through an incredible amount of diverse hires of what they call BIPOC faculty, almost a dozen scholars, actually. So, you know, one of the things I want to kind of bring back is that the university always remains a place where diversity can be practiced. And I do think it remains important. It's become a kind of thing now to dismiss diversity as tokenist and so on. But I think, I think we can bring it back into this conversation. And I think I'm reminded here by queer theorist Jen Harita Warren's comment in their book about Berlin, where they speak about assimilative revivals and regenerations and call them, and I quote, ascendancies that are uneven and contradictory and leave scores behind. So all of this to say that I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think much like feminism in the last 15 years or so, we have to accept the uneven modality of decolonization and embrace what you call vigilance, and keep working to re-engage this term, re-engage, rethink practices. And I find the concept of relinking really useful here and kind of very evocative. So my dilemma, and finally I have a question, remains with the schism that has come about between material decolonization and the cultural decolonization, which, as far, you know, when I'm thinking about the subject, they go hand in hand, they serve each other. But dismissing cultural decolonization is quite common now, or the claim that culture is an empty or a shallow site of intervention, it's too easy. So I worry that education, curricula, representational practices in the entertainment industry, publishing, and pop iterations of decolonization get swept under the carpet because it's not immediately about land back or instant abolition of capitalism. So I see some of this as a humanities and social sciences issue, or a kind of way to establish stakes. So I just wondered, you know, in a way that we need to engage new definitions of the term, because I think the old theories are a backbone or the spine of the contemporary cultural currents, but I think they demand new frameworks. So cultural decolonization for me is like bricks, and we need it, like a set of bricks, which are needed to rebuild this idea. So how would you mitigate a schism like this, especially since the university is a really potent site for cultural decolonization to be put in motion?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, all of that's kind of incredibly thoughtful, and I'm not sure I have sort of answers. I mean, I'll comment on your comments. I agree that the university is a potent and important site, and I think giving up on the university as a site to think about decolonization is fatal, because it is one of the few spaces where one has the ability and the responsibility and the privilege of being able to think about these things. The slight caveat there is remembering, I suppose, in the spirit of what I argue in the essay, that the university comes to decolonization later in the day, that decolonization as a historical term is political practice, ideological thinking, it's movements, and then the movements to which the university allies itself. So absolutely, there is no schism, and we should resist. I'm with you in saying that I'm very impatient with cultural versus material, or representational versus land. I take the point that critics make, that too often, and we have had many years of this in academia, thinking that, writing an essay on a heart of darkness is your bit for decolonization, right? That's done and dusted. And there was and has been for very many years a certain primacy of discursive linguistic change substituting for all other changes. So I understand the caution. And I understand why there are those who have historically pushed for the material to be given its rightful place. But again, I go back to the idea of the dialogical. I mean, if you look at the work of people like Raymond Williams or Edward Said, or indeed Césaire, for them, the material and the culture are, again, part of a constant dialectic, and you can't have the one without the other. And I think partly what the phenomenon you're pointing to is a kind of, a reaction, an overreaction to the primacy of the linguistic, the primacy of the purely cultural. But I don't see any reason not to articulate the two together. One thing I will say though, and I think it's interesting, I think this is the point at which some of my colleagues who quite unusually read the piece slightly balked when I said, well, actually, it isn't just the classroom or our research, but it does mean you have to be involved with Fees Must Fall. You must be involved with student movements. You must be involved with movements to, for the living wage on campus, or organizing janitors. In other words, we have to do the work of undoing the boundary between the classroom and the world, or the world, the text and the critic, right, to use Said's trenchant title. I think your points are very well taken if we remain vigilant about not retreating into silos, and keeping that engagement going. On the point about diversity, as I said in my own comments, I am also not one of these people who knocks diversity and says, "Oh, that's just that's rubbish." But it is also true that historically diversity has been used. It doesn't have to be used in this way, but it has been used to contain energies. It has been used to make do, and to not actually engage with the difficult questions of decolonization. And it has worked very well. I mean, capitalism is quite happy with diversity in many ways. So again, an anti-colonial diversity, right? That we have diversity, but that it be one that is anti-colonial and critical. I mean, personally, my classroom has been radically transformed between when I first got here and did not see a single non-white face, to actually having, vocal Black women in the classroom. And it has taken 20 odd years for that to happen. But the classroom is a different place, simply because the nature and tone and dynamics of the discussion shifts. So I do think with you that diversity is pedagogically important. So there need not be a schism, but we have to keep working at there not being a schism.
Yeah, thank you so much, Priya. That's a lot of good thoughts. And just very quickly, because you spoke about Césaire, I think and people know, but Césaire was also mayor of Fort-de-France for so many years. And one of the things he did do was the material and the cultural together. He renamed all the streets, he renamed the monuments, he did these kinds of dual, like multiple plural gestures. So that's kind of an interesting model also to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. I think now it's Srilata.
Thanks, Momita. And thank you very much, Professor Gopal. I completely agree with Bhakti that listening to you speak about the paper gives it a slightly kind of reshaped understanding as compared to reading it in text. So a little bit of background before I present my question. I'm a geographer by training, and like many of us on this panel and many amongst the attendees also, I can see I'm one of the people who's made that journey, from the post-colony to the Metropolitan University, also as a member of the caste class elite within the post-colony. And so I particularly appreciate your emphasis in the paper on the importance of place and the importance of historical context in determining what decolonization should look like, as well as in the sort of geographical reversal in the flow of ideas what you refer to as reverse tutelage, in terms of anti-colonial dissenters in Britain taking lessons from anti-colonial dissenters in the post-colony or the colony at that time. So keeping all of this in mind, oh, and I also very much appreciate your mentioning of racial capitalism and of the recent events around Hindutva and Hindutva ideologues appropriating the language of decolonization, of course. So keeping all of that in mind, I wonder how you see the future of racial division of labor within the intellectual work of decolonization. And the racial division of labor, the global racial division of labor has been quite central to the concept of coloniality as well. So it has never been divorced from, you know, materiality in that sense. So how do you see the racial division of labor in the intellectual work of decolonization, and where is it best performed? You know, is it possible to decolonize, for example, without dissolving this gap between metropolitan and not metropolitan universities? And how do we start to do that? Where is that work to be performed, and who is to perform it?
I mean, these are such difficult questions, Srilata. I mean, thank you again. I received your question ahead of time, and I have been thinking about it since looking at it, and it's a tough one. I suppose I would say this, that I do think that learning from below is a useful concept. Learning from, if you like, the epistemic privilege of the marginalized and of the exploited and of those who are at the bottom of the hierarchy or at different places in the hierarchy. That doesn't just translate into global North learning from global South, although, as I said at the very beginning of today's discussion, decolonization is an idea that has precisely moved from the colonized world to the metropole. I remember a sort of sweet and cringing moment a year or two ago, when before the pandemic, in a live room, if anybody can actually remember that, where one of my students, one of my very earnest, bright and very enthusiastic first years, asked a group of speakers, all of whom were women of color. He said, "It's all very well us discussing decolonization in Cambridge, but how do we take it out into the post-colonial world?" And it was I spoke to him later, and I said, "Well, look, this is a moment of a certain kind of blinkeredness, but actually you are discussing it in Cambridge because it has come to you from the post-colonial world." So understanding that line of influence, I think, is quite important. The reason I say that it isn't just about global South and global North is precisely because once you identify a knowledge hierarchy or a power differential, then you are obliged to keep observing them. And I share your journey, right? I mean, and I'm glad you pointed to, I mean, even the constitution of this particular panel, on the one hand, women of color. Well, on the other hand, and I'll go out on a limb, I don't know everybody's personal histories, and say privileged caste, privileged communities, definitely privileged class, in academia. So for me, the whole question of racialized division of labor, partly to say that, the learning must happen, the metropole must learn from the former colony. But then it gets messy. Here we are in the Northern Academy. So that means we are now part of that structure. So it is no longer simple to say, oh, well, so, this just means white men need to learn from us. Clearly not, because now we have helped shape the global North. So I guess I don't have a simple answer to your question, other than to say that one has to keep reminding oneself to learn from below, and that obligation does not just run along the lines of white and non-white, or white people and people of color. It does in some ways, but in some ways not, and other things shape that. I think for me, working on decolonization now, as all of us are doing, has had me thinking much more strongly about caste than I've had to in the past, because you cannot demand that a racialized division of labor be addressed, or a racialized knowledge practices be addressed, without then thinking about caste and in some ways even worse forms of authority and exploitation. So I don't have a simple answer to your question, partly because it's complex terrain, but to just say that I think the imperative to learn from below is probably one that will stand us in good stead.
Thank you very much. I think now we are on to Saraya.
Thank you very much for this excellent discussion. My question has to do with the certain citations that you have of Hamid Dabashi, in particular certain interventions he has on the non-European. I mean, from a certain chapter that you quote in his book, Europe and Its Shadows, Dabashi does write about this moment of release. And if I may quote, he says, it's when Europe is effectively decentered, deauthorized, and de-universalized. The non-Europe is released from its binary entrapment and liberated to discover itself beyond Europe, before Europe, no longer in the shadow of Europe. Incredibly eloquent. But it reminded me about your discussion of Oriel College's Cecil Rhodes, the whole statue controversy. And just following up as far as what has happened. June 2021, college decides that they have a policy of retain and explain if they would receive any kind of criticism about keeping the statue. And so in returning to your essay, I know that you speak at length about how to reframe discussions of decolonization in light of anti-colonial thought. But I think less clear of your examination is, what is your actual response to these European institutions, be they academic, corporate, government, or a mix of the three, who just refuse or resist these attempts to be or to become decentered, or if they're challenged, if they're being challenged and it's not under their terms. So beyond this kind of intellectual decolonization, for instance, or your, proposing a response with methods like learning from below, or changing curricula, or supporting non-colonizing dialogues, and so on and so forth. What's your response when these attempts to decentralize or demonumentalize Europe are just denied and refused and neutralized by institutional elites? Like you say time and time again, the Metropolitan University, it can't be decolonized independently of society and economy. But I wage that it also can't happen without major political will, major political support, right? That these sort of have to be in companion. So I'm wondering if you can comment about that.
Well, I mean, you've touched on the nub of the challenge that we all live in. This is our reality that you have so eloquently described. Let me answer in a short form. My answer now about Oriel and so on. It is illegal, what I'm about to say, and B, it will probably get me a return appearance in the Daily Mail. But I think that in the case of Oriel, now protesters who wish to pull the statue down should feel free, because we have now exposed the lie that, we will do this through democratic discussion, we will do this in a civilized fashion, we will do this by means of a commission of inquiry and by voting, all of which has been done. And at the end of the day, the donors said no. End of story. I have a much more innocent example. I mean, I tried to have along with students of color, Black students in particular, tried to run a series on Churchill, race and empire, a discussion series. Nobody was talking about pulling statues down or doing anything, violent. They shut the discussion series down. I mean, never mind Oriel. This was even the old lie that we must talk, we must have conversations. That was shown to be a lie. So what should you do in these circumstances? I guess I can only say that one continues one's own anti-colonial practices wherever one is. I don't think that the university will change overnight, but I also would say that the quality of responses, the attention given to some of these questions has undoubtedly shifted in, granted, a 20-year span or a 10-year span. I completely see what you say about political will and it needing much, much more than a set of academic discussions or a set of curricular changes. I am torn, I think, Soraya, on the one hand, between saying, my God, the Goliath is so huge, nothing will change. Here it is, we have a country after country voting in manifestly tyrannical, unhinged, exploitative millionaires and billionaires or representatives thereof to power. No matter what these people do, there is no accountability. There's no point in doing anything. That's my one, when I think about the political will that will be needed and the changes that will be needed, that is the part of me that says, just go listen to music, give up. But on the other hand, I think it would be wrong to say that things have not shifted. And that, for instance, it's not just, Black voices and Black people who have forced open certain discussions that were not happening 10 years ago. But in India, I think that, the caste critique is more salient than it once was. And that is because there is now a growing profile of Dalit and Bahujan intellectuals who are able to be what I call in my book, I call interpreters of insurgency, and who are putting into the public domain certain questions that have to be answered, that you can't anymore pretend don't exist. So I guess, again, I'm torn between deep despair and on the other hand saying, well, yeah, incremental changes. See, I don't think we have the luxury of choosing despair. And I don't think we have the luxury of completely refusing incremental change. I mean, the answer, and this goes back to the point that Bhakti made, people saying, oh, never mind diversity, or that's just identity politics or whatever. Well, yeah, but, incremental change and a little bit less racism is still quite welcome in the face of what are huge, pretty huge challenges. And I don't have the answer to how we deal with those challenges other than relentlessly democratize and relentlessly remain insurgent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sandra, could I ask you to go next? Because given the volume of questions, I'm just wondering if I can withhold mine till the end to see if someone else is asking a similar question.
Okay.
You do have a question, and I really appreciate the time the panel took to draft their questions. So please do. I'll keep the answer short.
Okay. So should I just go then?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's often something that we say in my kind of discipline, which would be more area studies, I guess, or I do a lot of field work. And, there's this saying that area studies and anthropology are really the margins of disciplines and the study of margins and so on. And I'm wondering, what has happened to this fashion of moving away from Eurocentrism in these disciplines. And one of the things that has become really, again, fashionable is what you were referring to as radical alterity. That resonated with me a lot from your piece. The fact that, there is a representation of a native that has to be ideal, has to be untouched by anything that is considered European. So let's say if an Adivasi person is reading Lenin, and thinking about equality, they are dismissed often quite clearly as an activist. They are no longer native enough. And you use the term petrification, which I think is very good in this context of a certain kind of neo-colonial Orientalism of the natives of the global South, that to be ideal subjects for fieldwork, they need to have never touched a Lenin or a Mao or an Ambedkar, or they don't have a concept of constitutional democracy. They're all imbued in this kind of otherworldly Hindu or indigenous religiosity world. So I was wondering if you would want to tell us a little bit about Kusikanki and your wonderful use of her thoughts, and what you think, if that would be very useful, I think, to a lot of our listeners as well. Thank you.
I promise to keep the answer short. So let me put it this way. I think you yourself have just laid it out very beautifully, that there is this temptation to assert radical alterity. I have multiply asked people what it means. So give me an example of radical alterity. I have never gotten one. I think that the problem isn't just one of saying that tribals don't want to read Ambedkar or Lenin, but I think the problem actually goes back to the pushing back of Eurocentrism and the Enlightenment and Europe so much that it became necessary to reject reason with a small r as well, right? And I remember writing about this many years ago when I was assessing the Subaltern Studies School and talking about some of the late Subaltern Studies work, and saying, not only is it now that we must pay attention to enchantment or what we might not normally pay attention to, but we must insist that the subaltern is not rational, right? That the subaltern from the start will not do reason. And this has consequences, because and I'm not going to name names here, but there was a particular version of the subaltern that came to us that is now the permanent version of the subaltern. And any subaltern who doesn't meet that version of the subaltern is no subaltern, right? So the subaltern must read Derrida. Maybe not Ambedkar, maybe not Lenin, and not Kant or not or whoever, Marx. And the painting of the subaltern as this particular kind of intellectual who will not do reason, I think that's percolated. And this goes back to my point about, are we conceding too much to Europe? I'm not particularly willing to hand reason over to Europe, because that's what Europe has been saying all along. So I'm not at all sure why we should say, you're right, you guys do reason, we do something else. And people like Césaire are scathing about the ontological turn. And he says, yeah, we know all about Bantus who don't need food, who are just completely spiritual, and how convenient the ontological is to the colonizer. And of course, Kusikanki is pretty, this is the book on practices and discourses of decolonization, because she also points out that there is this kind of ossification of the indigene, as though the indigene isn't interacting with history, as if the indigene isn't interacting with modernity and isn't part of it and isn't making it. So yeah, sorry, that's the short, very, very rushed answer.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Sindre, do you want to?
Yes, I'll try to do this shortly. So we need to say to any editors from the Daily Mail who may be listening in, just don't do it. We're coming for your statues in any event. Now, thank you very much, Professor Gopal. This has been a great session. I want to go back to the question of the distinction between post-colonial and decolonial approaches So a central dividing line between postcolonial and decolonial approaches seems to relate to the question of how to interpret Frantz Fanon's work on decolonization, because Fanon has, for better or for worse, become the proverbial man of all seasons. In your article, the Decolonization and the University, you argue against Tuck and Young's invocation of Fanon as having been committed to an ethic of incommensurability, and also against Walter B. Magnolo's idea of Fanon having advocated some sort of delinking by pointing out that Fanon stood in an anti-colonial tradition and that his targets, the targets of his multi-pronged critique, were often as much both native tyrannies and nationalist elites as they were colonial rulers. Now, if we think of Fanon and Fanon in relation to his mentor and supervisor Césaire, one could argue that, you know, the point is not to de-link, but to, in the words of Achille Mbembe, to make the world whole again. In other words, Césaire's humanism made to the measure of the world. Now, in your 2019 monograph, Insurgent Empire, you document the extent to which anti-colonial resistance and thought was premised on transnational networks and processes of learning and exchange between the so-called colonial metropolises and the colonial peripheries, the process of reverse tutelage in your terms. And you have on several occasions declared yourself to be standing in an anti-colonial rather than a decolonial tradition. And so I would like you to expound on what you see as the pitfalls of some of the strands of decolonial thinking as it pertains to the present.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me start with the last bit, and I'm trying to remember what you said at the beginning about Fanon. Yeah, that's about Fanon. I don't want to overstress my differences from those who propagate, I guess, the decolonial strand of decolonization. I think there is much in common in terms of thinking about the deep traumatic and damaging legacies of the European colonial project and the need to radically transform the world we live in from the legacy of that project. But I do think that the reason I prefer anti-colonial practice to decolonial as a concept is precisely the fact that there are native tyrannies and injustices and hierarchies, which, as Césaire pointed out, far from resisting the European colonizer, worked very beautifully with him. So to me, the question of decolonizing is not legible without talking about, in Césaire's terms, native tyrannies, without talking about indigenous structures of exploitation. Biographically, anybody who comes from a caste society is not in a very good position to talk about race hierarchies. And the fact that if you want to talk about race hierarchies, that has to be articulated alongside a critique of caste. So I think my concern where the decolonial school is concerned is insufficient attention, as I see it, to the question of native hierarchies, tyrannies, injustices, structures. And secondly, and this brings me to the point about Fanon, the relationship to modernity. Fanon, whatever you might say about Fanon and however much you might read him to fit your view, there is no way you can make Fanon an anti-modernist. I mean, the man is modernist in terms of we want bridges, we want railways, we want hospitals, we want schools, okay? I mean, I would critique him with a certain excessive developmentalism, but he cannot be charged with anti-modernity, right? So Is Fanon calling for delinking from modernity? Absolutely not. He may be wrong in that, but he is certainly not saying modernity and decolonization are incommensurable or need to be delinked. There's a very powerful essay which I often cite, but very few people read, and it's called Medicine and Colonialism. And it's a really good moment in the pandemic moment for us to think about. I have thought about that essay because it's actually an essay about why people refuse vaccines or injections. And he says, I fully understand why the colonized refuses medicine, because to him, it comes at the hands of an oppressive institution. But he doesn't say, oh, therefore, let's walk away from medicine. He says, this is the tragic lie of the colonial situation, that even when I know a particular injection works for cholera, I am treated suspiciously by my patient because I represent an oppressive system. And he doesn't say yay for refusal. The doctor is actually anguished that he can't make the case for the injection. So I think modernity is complicated. I think modernity is a deeply, troubled formation, but it's not unrelentingly bad. In many ways, it has brought to us all the good things that intellectual work across cultures can bring. So I would want to say that you can't reject delink from modernity quite so simply, but also we need to think about the colonized as makers of modernity, not just recipients of modernity. The enslaved particularly made modernity possible in certain ways. And so I think I have questions about what delinking might mean, and I have questions about what it means to talk about delinking as decolonization without talking about, or decoloniality without talking about structures and hierarchies of injustices in colonial or formerly colonized contexts.
Excellent. Should we take some questions from the attendees then? Bhakti, I'm wondering if you want to start by reading out a question from Facebook.
Yes, sure, I can do that. There's a lot of things on Facebook, so I'll summarize one or two, and then take a couple at once. Some might be quick. We had James Miller, who had a question, but actually it was more of a comment, so I don't think I'll take it, because they say that universities cannot be decolonized, they can be abolished, and go with Morton and Harney's theory with that. And there's a long comment there. Let me take this question from Charlie Samuya Verick, who says, Neil Lazarus has long called attention to the radical politics of anti-colonialism as an antidote to the culturalism of post-colonialism. How different is decolonization from the academic theory of post-colonialism by your lights? And then there's a couple of very related questions, one by Madhurima Nayak, who says, do you think post-colonial studies in general should engage with peace studies? And Swajan Kumar Datta is asking, what do you think about Rabindranath Tagore and his plans of Vishwabharati University? So let's start with the Neil Lazarus question.
Yeah, I understand Neil to be critiquing a tendency in a salient and influential strand of post-colonial studies, which was, and I referred to this earlier, which was comfortable moving away from the material and comfortable, particularly not talking about capitalism, and took refuge in a certain culturalism. I think that if I understand the question to be, how is decolonization different from that strand of post-colonialism which Neil is critiquing? Well, as I said in the paper and in response to the panel's questions, I don't think that one has to do culture versus materiality. I think they have to be in dialogue. I would see Neil's own work as putting culture and capitalism, or material and discursive, into dialogue. How do I see decolonization as different from POCO? I don't necessarily. I've never really gone along with the, I guess, the Vivek Chibber mode of dismissing all postcolonial studies as deeply compromised and irretrievably apolitical. I think it really does depend on how you do it. And I think if you keep the relationship of culture and capitalism, of materialism and ideological in the frame, then you do a different kind of postcolonial work. Postcolonial simply means the world in the wake of colonialism. I don't see it as a religion. I see it as a kind of sort of historical marker, and you can do political work within it, or you can do apolitical work within it. However, I think the time has probably come to retire, and I'm not saying Neil is like this, he's not. I think the time has come to retire the kind of, the version of critique which is all about tough boys repudiating culture and focusing on kind of masculine material questions. This is very boring routine, and it's unnecessary. And I hope that we can go past that and keep things in dialogue that need to be in dialogue. Peace studies. Yes, well, disarmament was a central plank of many anti-colonial movements, and indeed it was central to the discussions at Bandung in 1955. I suppose, yes, disarmament and the military-industrial complex have to be abolished as a consequence of decolonization. But as always, when people raise peace, what can one say? No justice, no peace. So the question of justice is central. And as you know, the oft misquoted Martin Luther King says that, yeah, you have to get to peace and you have to keep peace central, but you have to address questions of justice in order to keep that question salient. What was I don't know anything about Vishwabharati. I'm deeply sorry. I think Tagore himself was very, very incipiently, and what is the word I'm looking for? Prophetically bright about the dangers of a particular kind of decolonization that came to us through Indian nationalism, or any nationalism for that matter. I don't know anything about Vishwabharati, and if I did, I would say more, but sorry.
Okay. Momita, should I throw out a couple more from Facebook, or what do you think? Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry. I think we have 10 more minutes. I can ask a question from Facebook and one from our panel here. Yeah?
Go ahead.
So one of the questions is from Yao. I'm sorry if I'm ruining your name. He says he's Brazilian. He lives in London. He says, I would like to make a question. How can we reflect about the singularity, within brackets neither new or old, of the repetitive events, colonial practices, inside the universities through decolonial perspectives or from decolonial perspectives? Should I ask another one?
You can break that down for me. I'm not entirely sure I understood.
Yes, so there are a lot of, if you can see in the Q&A, it's,
okay.
It's the first question.
I'm not sure. Do you want to invite the speaker to say more?
Yeah. Could you type a little bit more if you're still here, so that we understand?
If anybody, does anybody else? Yeah. I might just be tired.
I think I would also need clarification. But we have another question now. How can we combine decolonization with the post-Enlightenment history and discoveries on the field of natural sciences? European countries have dominated the scientific discoveries?
Yeah, in part because they have the resources accrued from colonialism and therefore have the institutions, and that includes universities, which sit on the bedrock of that which came from colonialism. But the people who are actually producing knowledge are not necessarily European. In fact, very overwhelmingly, if my university is anything to go by, they're very much from the global south. So again, not especially irreconcilable. What I'm more interested in, and this is something I don't know anything about, is the longer history of the sciences, and to go back to the, I guess, through philological work and historical work in one sense, to undo the notion that scientific thinking or science is somehow almost biologically or racially European idea. It isn't. That which we recognize as science today has very, very deep roots in multiple contexts, including so much of Africa and Asia. So I would be interested. I'm less worried about the irreconcilability of that in the present than in trying to decolonize science through thinking about precisely the tributary knowledges that went into forming post-Enlightenment science.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you another question from Bipasha Bhattacharya. She asks, what do you see as a viable separating line from what you call, quote, native hierarchies from non-native? Can we not argue that any such distinction is anachronistic?
It's anachronistic in the sense of if you want to absolutely say that there is no such thing as colonizer and colonized, or no such thing as native and outsider. In some absolute sense, there isn't. But on the other hand, I think that requires not thinking about how cultures and communities constitute themselves. So yes, borders are constructs. A lot of things are, race is a construct. That doesn't mean it doesn't have operative force, right? So you have a construct, you recognize. So it's a bit like, if you talk about race in the public domain, there will inevitably be white reply guy who says, why do you see color? I don't see color. And I don't see race. And you say, well, yeah, very good for you, because there is no such thing as race. It doesn't mean it doesn't operate provisionally in a contingent way, but in a very forceful and sharp manner. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is a very, in a sense, a very handy argument to say, well, I don't recognize, native and non-native, so I'm not gonna, you can say there is no such thing as caste. Ultimately, caste is completely a construct. There could be nothing more anachronistic in a sense than saying but does it not have an operative force? I'm afraid it does, a very, very lethal and material force.
Thank you very much. Bhakti, do you want to pick up another question from Facebook? I think we have 5 more minutes or so.
Yes, there was one on Edward Said. Just let me track it here.
Domain, there will inevitably be one.
Sorry, there's a lag. Okay, so we have a question from Darish Izadi, who asks, I think Edward Said made it very clear that a distinction needs to be made between pure and political knowledge. What can we do to hold university officials accountable? Yeah, that's a tough one, Priya.
Tough as in how does one hold university officials accountable is tough. Or do you mean the distinction between pure and political knowledge?
I think both are tough.
Well, I think, one thing that I think is very important, and I'm afraid this is as concrete as I can get, is to keep reminding university officials that the university belongs to students and teachers and others who work there, and that it is, our university. And it sounds trite, but I think the fact is that the function of a university is working with knowledge. Edward Said did make a distinction between pure and political knowledge eventually. And I think what is really important about his work is the work that he does subsequent to Orientalism. In Orientalism, knowledge is entirely political, and it's very much coming out of Foucault. There is no point in talking about things like truth or reality or actuality. I think in his last set of lectures, he was which again, I mean, to go back to what Sindre was pointing to when he was discussing Achille Mbembe's, what is it, Making Whole Again. In his last lectures, Said is very clear that in order for intellectual work to be respected, intellectuals must respect that work. And intellectuals do need to be invested in such a notion as truth, which had a very bad rap for many, many years, partly because of the salience of Foucault and Derrida, which I'm not slamming them entirely, but Said does in these lectures talk about the problem of facile anti-foundationalism. That is his phrase, facile anti-foundationalism. So yeah, I think we have to find a way to defend pure knowledge without overlooking the politics of how knowledge is made and disseminated and who gets to own it. So I don't think the two are at odds.
Thank you so much. Sindre, we have at the last minute a couple of questions. I'm wondering if we have time for it. Professor Gopal, there are 2 questions now.
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah?
We can do the 2 last questions now, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then let me ask a question from Carolina Gatt. I'm sorry, again, names, sorry. I'm an anthropologist working to develop collaborative research processes where the whole orthopraxy of academic work is imbued with Enlightenment/colonial aspects, or in Boaventura de Sousa Santos's terminology, epistemological colonialism. I really appreciated your points about dialogical processes, and my question is about, quote, Europe. Do you see Europe as a homogeneous entity, or do you consider the oppression of different ways of living/knowing which emerge within, quote, European territories, but have been entirely banned from academia as invalid knowledge?
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think somewhere along in the piece, which I'm now forgetting my essay, I do mention that actually the way in which Europe is homogenized in its own discourse doesn't do Europe any favors. And in Insurgent Empire, one of the things I set out to do, and this is actually how I present it to many audiences, particularly kind of heavily white audiences, that you can't actually homogenize Europe, and that Europe itself, not just provincialized, but it needs to be unpacked. And in being unpacked, we also see hierarchies within Europe which have shaped its presentation to the world. Whatever it is, colonialism may have benefited, entire countries, but it was a class project. It was very much a class project of European ruling elites. And one of the things that British anti-colonials and other anti-colonials in France and elsewhere a point that they would make is that the working classes of, for instance, of Europe had more in common with the colonized than with the colonizer. So absolutely, I think undoing the homogeneity of Europe is crucial. Again, a reason why I resist ideas that call for a certain delinking or a certain segregation of cultural and civilizational contexts, because I don't think that is ultimately helpful to knowledge production, because knowledge is made through a process of linking and engagement.
Thank you so much. And then if I may ask a last question from Mark Aranha. The colonial year dismissed indigenous music as unintelligible nonsense, and within brackets, Weber's famous random agglomeration of semitones. I understand your stance on knowledges. Is music not an example of a place where we can accommodate plurality of knowledges?
Absolutely, but actually music is a very good example of, like language, musical forms shade into each other. So there can't be an absolute separation. There's on the one hand, there is sort of a range of human sounds that the human ear is, listens to, and that the human voice produces. But musical traditions are not completely segregatable, if that's a word. Like language, each tradition shades into another. At some point, they may be separated by vast distances, but between them, there are shadings. So I'm not against plurality. I think what I'm against is alterity and segregation. I don't think that segregation and siloing knowledge actually makes any sense, because that is not how knowledge itself is produced. That is not how music emerges. That is not how language emerges.
Can I say, Mumita, Priya, Kristen, and Srilata, we have a lovely message from Madhulika Singh from Sydney, who has been unhappy in lockdown, and she and her friend have been feeling inspired by this panel. And she says, listening to intelligent, articulate, engaging, self-reflective gorgeous of women of color, making meaning out of concepts we are experiencing and still learning to articulate has been life-affirming. Thank you, Queens. Sindra, you can include yourself in that as well.
Sindra is an honorary queen.
Indeed, he is.
Well,
So
I just wanted to say I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions. I have quickly managed to take screenshots, so I will be reflecting on them. Thank you to all the panelists for amazing questions, but also to everyone who has put a question in the box, and I will be looking at them. Many thanks.
So without further flourishes, and as the proverbial white heterosexual male pushing 50, I obviously have to have the last word here as well. Before I launch a rights movement for non-Bengalis and white males. But thank you so much, Professor Gopal, for this wonderful Zoom webinar. We are most grateful for you taking the time and making the effort to contribute here. We also need to thank all our attendees for a set of wonderful questions, and of course all the panelists at Theory from the Margins. We are still in the process of sorting out our program, but we will announce the next guest in Theory from the Margins as soon as we have that boxed. Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon or early morning, wherever you may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.